Phase 1 trials are generally small trials. Phase 1 trials are trials that are not conducted in every hospital centre which does research because it is a very resource intensive kind of program where essentially what you're doing is you have a pharmaceutical agent that has been identified in the laboratory to be potentially effective for cancer. So yes, there are phase 1 trials specifically for breast cancer, but often phase 1 trials involve any patient with a solid cancer, be it lung, breast, prostate, or anything else. And essentially, because the laboratory evidence suggests that it is an effective drug in animals and in the petri dish, the first step that has to be taken is to try it out in humans. Now, you can have phase 1 trials where the agent is actually given to healthy individuals, but I'm not going to talk about that because it's much more relevant that in patients with metastatic disease, phase 1 drug trials are trying to identify two things. One is, in human beings with cancer, what are the potential mild, moderate, or severe side effects? So when some people occasionally still use the phrase experimental, in terms of being a synonym for clinical trials. In a sense, it's a bit experimental because this is the first opportunity the drug has actually been used in human beings with cancer. The second goal of a phase 1 trial is to identify which tumor type is most likely to do well and respond to the treatment. So that as the trial is being conducted, they're dynamically evaluating what side effects patients complain of, men, women with whatever cancers that is allowed into the trial. And the dose of the drug is continually increased in small increments until you reach the dose where you think it is likely to be best tolerated, but also with no further serious side effects beyond that dose. And in that period of time, while you're collecting information on the cancer patients, you're trying to identify which tumor type is likely to respond well to that drug. Now, it is intensive because it usually involves a lot of time for the patient in the hospital. It involves a lot of blood testing. It involves other tests such as ECGs and X-rays and so forth. And potentially, as I've said, because you're trying to find out what the potential side effects are, it can make patients very, very ill. So that even after their required visits to hospital, they may need to be readmitted to hospital to manage the side effects. So I think we need phase 1 trials because otherwise we never identify what are the new agents that we should use moving into the next trials. But the patients that go into phase 1 trials are essentially patients who've already received all the best possible drug therapies for their cancer type. So we generally don't offer phase 1 trials to a newly diagnosed cancer patient. And it's because patients have already received and benefited or not benefited from the known drugs that they wish to consider being considered for a phase 1 trial. Phase 1 trials' ballpark response rate is usually quite low. So generally, because you're really testing it out in the first instance in patients with cancer, you generally expect a response rate in the order of about 10 to 15%. So when if you're ever offered a phase 1 trial, I guess the questions you want to ask is, what are the suspected side effects? And how likely is it that it's going to affect my well-being whilst we're trying to figure out whether it helps me? Phase 2 trials are larger trials, and as the name implies, it follows on from a phase 1 trial. So a phase 2 trial will be largely restricted to one tumor type. It's very rare that you do a phase 2 trial in two different tumor types, unless there's a very specific reason. These are all metastatic patients. So again, these are patients that may or may not have already received the standard treatment recommended for their type of breast cancer. And it's conducted once results are published for phase 1 trials, demonstrating that the phase 1 trials have indicated that this drug might be effective in this particular type of breast cancer that the woman has. We know and we expect what the side effects are going to be. So we enter phase 2 trials with a lot more confidence of how to prevent side effects in the women going to the trial, also knowing how to monitor them on the trial. But now we're really trying to see how effective the drug treatment is. By and large, phase 2 trials don't have placebos. So most women that are offered, and men with metastatic disease that are offered phase 2 trials, will be having the confidence that they know that they're going to get the new drug. Not always, because sometimes the drug is considered so similar to an existing drug in its formulation, in its activity, that they actually want to try and achieve two goals with the one trial. So there may be occasional trials where a patient is offered a phase 2 trial. So again, if you're offered a phase 2 trial, always ask the question, am I certain that I'm going to get the new drug? If I'm not, am I going to be getting a placebo, or am I just going to be the control? I'm just going to get whatever I was going to get anyway and not get the new drug. In this kind of trial, it's really, really intensive, and it's very, very important to actually constantly measure how well the cancer is responding. So phase 2 trials will place a lot of emphasis on the correct frequency of CT scans, MRI scans, bone scans, clinical examination, because it's really crucial for a drug to move beyond a phase 2 trial that we know very, very accurately how effective it is. And to know how effective it is, you have to measure it. And my next topic, talking about scans, will give you a little bit of insight into that. Often within a phase 2 trial, the patient will be given an opportunity to receive the new drug up until such time it no longer is effective. So that's what I mean by time to breast cancer progression. So again, an advantage of being an offered phase 2 trial is that you may actually get a very, very effective drug 3 to 5 to 7 years before it comes onto the market. And I've certainly got a number of patients that I've managed over the last 20 years who are now alive and discharged and well because they actually got entry into phase 2 trial, and it made all the difference in their lives. They got access to this new drug, they didn't have to pay for it, they got access to it until it either stopped working or until it was actually available on the PBS and they could get it as a normal part of standard of care.
Excuse me, Professor Chan.
Yep.
When you talk about one tumour type, are you suggesting that with metastatic breast cancer, women can have multiple types of tumour, or are you talking about the organs that it's in when you say one tumour?
Probably neither. When I talk about different types of breast cancer, I'm talking about the biological behavior and characteristic of that breast cancer cell. So largely in breast cancer, we consider that there are 3 major types of breast cancer. There are those that are triple negative. So they're cancer cells which are biopsied from the breast or in a distant organ, lacks estrogen receptor, progesterone receptor, and HER2 receptors. There are those with HER2 positive breast cancers, and it's rare that you would then divide those patients up into whether they've got estrogen receptors or not. So if you've got a HER2 positive breast cancer, irrespective of what your cancer's estrogen and progesterone receptor status is, you're regarded as a HER2 positive case. And then there is the hormone receptor positive, HER2 negative, or what we call luminal breast cancers, that will expect to have some degree of responsiveness to anti-hormone drugs, but anti-HER2 drugs won't work in that tumor type. Phase 3 trials are what makes the difference. And I'm really, really pleased to say that, of about the 1,400 patients that are put onto clinical trials, a large number of women were involved in phase 3 trials, and their participation made it possible to know which drugs should now be offered to women with breast cancer all over the world. And I think, whether or not women recognise that, that's a big contribution that women in Perth make. If they're part of a phase 3 trial and they get the drug or they don't get the drug, their involvement in the trial allowed that drug to be identified as the best new drug for that type of breast cancer, and then it has been rolled out to women around the world. And overall, we've been involved in, I think, about 4 pivotal phase 3 trials where Perth contributed the most numbers of patients to those trials in the entire world. But the benefit to that is more women in WA got access to a new drug before anybody else in the rest of the world, plus were integral in getting that drug listed as the new standard of care for other women. So women involved in those trials should really feel good about that. Phase 3 trials, for the context of our talk, obviously is offered to patients with metastatic breast cancer, but we also do phase 3 trials in early breast cancer. That's how, over the last 20 years, we've been able to understand what drugs are best to use in women who have non-metastatic breast cancer after they've had their primary surgery. Phase 3 trials, because of the very nature of how important the results are, will often require hundreds to thousands of patients. So it's virtually never ever done in a single site. It might be done in one country, but more often than not, it's what's called a multi-center global international study where there may be up to 400 or 500 hospitals contributing patients to the one single trial. So if you just think about the dynamics of how to run that kind of trial, it probably starts to explain to you why doing clinical trials requires so much rigor and involvement and resources and commitment. Once the trials are done, and I've got to be very honest with you, not all phase 3 trials are positive trials. I was on the steering committee of one of the largest phase 3 trials conducted in the last 8 years. It included 5,500 women, and unfortunately it was a negative trial. Not that the new drug caused harm, but it didn't add additional benefits. So my estimate is probably the company spent in the order of several hundreds millions of dollars to do those trials. There were no new side effects, so none of the women involved in the trial were detrimentally affected, but their involvement allowed us to understand that this drug does not need to be part of the new treatment given to other women with early breast cancer. So a really important negative result. Lastly, because of the nature of phase 3 trials and that these drugs are now going to be the standard of care to offer to women and men with breast cancer, there is a lot of auditing. And this comes from the health regulatory bodies in each different precinct in each different country. And drugs will not get reimbursed and put onto in Australia onto the PBS until the health regulatory authorities have reviewed all the crucial data and agree with the interpretation and the safety and the effectiveness of the drug. So often when women ask me, I read a story that this drug is the newest thing for my kind of cancer, when is it going to be available? And I sort of say, perhaps 3 to 5 years. The reason is that you've got to make sure that the data is robust enough and in a big enough group of patients to be put forward for registration to health regulators. Australia is not the fastest country to authorise drugs, but I think the broad availability of drugs that women and men with breast cancer get access to in Australia is the same as anywhere else in the rest of the world. And I think the time taken and the regulatory requirements is all just part and parcel of ensuring that this is a safe and effective drug to offer patients in Australia. So why do we need to do trials? I'm very pleased that in the last probably 10 years, I haven't had any patients come to me and say, I had a chat about this trial you talked to me about with my GP, and they say, I'm just a guinea pig. I'm just going to be used for experiment. And I'm really, really pleased because I think the wider medical fraternity, including general physicians and family doctors who don't do clinical trials, understand the importance, the validity, the safety, and the usefulness of clinical trials, where they will try and do their bit to inform their patients as to why they need to do it. But it's really because all of us who do clinical trials have one basic goal. We want to save more lives. We want women to be cured and men to be cured. We want men and women with metastatic breast cancer to be cured, if it's possible, to live longer lives and to be free of the symptoms that progressive metastatic breast cancer causes. So that's the underlying commitment that drives clinical research. Secondly, breast cancer, above all other, I think, solid tumours, at the earliest stages, had that very strong belief that you have to understand what the likelihood of effectiveness is in the laboratory. And so there was a lot of years, a lot of effort, a lot of money spent in identifying molecular pathways, what drives cancers before you actually put it into patients as well. And I'm going to, yes?
I just wonder, I mean, I'm big on trials myself, but if a trial, say like phase 2, includes a placebo, this is practically a death sentence for the person who is now stuck on the placebo.
No. In breast cancer, and I can say this absolutely without contradiction, is that in a phase 2 trial in metastatic breast cancer that offers a placebo, the only reason to offer a placebo is up to that point, all the laboratory data and phase 1 data suggests and provides the basis for why the new drug might work. All right? But there is not enough biological belief to know that it is actually going to be better. So if you have a drug that you think is safe and you actually believe it may make a difference, if you did a trial where every single patient got the drug, you'll never know whether it did better than the current drug.
No, I got that, but that placebo so you put the placebo there so we can say, okay, the 75 people got the new drug, 25 got the placebo, so we can test if 75 people got better, we knew the new drug worked. But that leaves these 25 people untreated.
No.
Untreated.
No. There are never any in breast cancer placebo-only arms in a clinical trial. So in a phase 2 trial where half the women get a placebo, it is always a placebo in addition to the best current drug. The treatment group gets the best current drug and the new drug. So we never ever do a placebo-only arm within a phase 2 trial. Never. Okay? So it's always every woman in the trial gets what's regarded as the best treatment at that time. Half the women will get the new drug, half the women will get the placebo, and both of those agents will look exactly the same, whether it's a pill or a drip. So it's completely ethical. You've got half the women already getting the best treatment, and you're trying to evaluate whether the new drug adds to, helps to, has fewer side effects to the best standard of treatment. So I can guarantee you the only reason where that you may consider a placebo arm where you don't do any active treatment is a non-therapeutic trial. So for instance, in the management of sore joints, some people wanted to know whether acupuncture might help, right? So what they did was just give some people acupuncture and some people no acupuncture, but a needle in a non-acupuncture point. All right, so they didn't, all these people were having whatever treatments they were, but the only thing that was being evaluated was the acupuncture placed properly or not. But you never have a therapeutic trial with drugs where half or a 25 or whatever proportion of women get absolutely nothing but the placebo. Never done in breast cancer. Good clinical practice is probably nothing that any of you need to know, but it is absolutely something that all medical practitioners involved in clinical research has to know. And it kind of doesn't really seem all that, onerous. What's good clinical practice? I'll come to it in a little bit. But essentially, good clinical practice is an international guideline formulation of what is necessary for all participants from the medical side, so doctors, nurses, research people, pathologists, radiologists, what rules and regulations that those health professionals have to abide by, number one, to be able to say that the trial that they were involved in is robust and accurate, and to make sure that patients have the best safety and care. And it's a huge, long list. And I think, as Claire, my fellow, will learn, it becomes more and more rigorous the more clinical trials that you do. To do clinical trials, this might all be stating the obvious, but you actually need committed staff and trained staff. The number of complexities in managing even one patient on a clinical trial involves many, many dedicated hours, understanding of what results mean, the frequency and speed of entering data so that the data is being collected whilst you're doing the clinical research. And it often involves absolutely the need for infrastructure. So like in any big organization, you cannot do clinical trials properly unless you've actually got every component of the clinical trials unit in place, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute. To do clinical trials, we can't do it by ourselves. So oncologists can't just do clinical trials with the help of their nurses and trial staff. We often rely on the pharmacists, we often rely on the radiologists, and we absolutely rely on the nurses who deliver the treatment for the patients when it's given intravenously. And I think the last thing, which I think a lot of junior researchers don't often get taught, is that when you want to think about doing a study, whether it's your own study or you've been invited to be part of a research study, even though the topic of to be research is really interesting, you have to know whether it's feasible. So it's no good being involved in a breast cancer trial that is looking at young patients with the BRCA gene, and it's specifically for that group. When you work within a fraternity which doesn't see a lot of young patients and don't have a lot of patients already in the system with the genetic abnormality. So doing a feasibility before you put your hand up to say, yes, I want to be involved, or even when you have an idea of something that you want to do, you've got to know that you've got the patients, the knowledge, the staff, and the infrastructure to be able to do the trial. So there's a lot of preparatory work that is necessary. And lastly, I think, again, this may or may not be obvious, but it certainly is obvious to me. It involves a lot more time than just taking care of patients. Not just from the doctors, it involves more time from patients. So any of you who have been involved in any of my clinical trials know you're here for longer visits, you're here more often than you need to be, and there's a lot more questions asked of you than what would normally be the case. And often that puts a responsibility on your families as well for transport and so forth and so forth. So to do good clinical research, you absolutely have to have commitment from everybody, and it's the job of the investigators to convey that to their patients that yes, we want to benefit you, but we need your commitment and your continuity and consistency in being involved. This is just a short list of who are the people involved in trials. So the principal investigator is usually the most senior oncologist who understands the biology and who will take on the responsibility for conducting that research. Co-investigators are usually also medical people, but they don't necessarily have to be oncologists. They could be the surgeons or the radiation oncologists. They contribute because they will help monitor patients while they're on the clinical trial. I've spoken about the trial staff, and my trial teams is just the best. I believe it's the best in Australia, even though I'm a bit biased. They're dedicated, they're keen, and most of all, they care about patients. So they're there to, collect a lot of data from you, but they actually care about what happens to you. And I've had a number of patients involved in clinical trials saying, I just love being part of the trial because I feel so supported. I feel so nurtured. I've got so many people in the team I can contact if I want to. Apart from, the nitty-gritty of doing the trials, we actually need ethics. So no trials largely that we will do for pharmaceutical drugs intervention is ever done without ethics approval. So this is an independent authority. Most of us who do a lot of clinical trials in Australia use a single national ethics group called Bellbury, which is based in Adelaide. And they're made up of senior physicians, legal, consumers, allied health, who review the protocol and say, do we think this is an ethical thing to do? And they often come back with questions, and there's a bit of toing and froing. You need to change this, make this clearer, otherwise patients, will be not cared for. So there's a lot of communication and time in preparation. And then obviously we can't do any of this without having good governance. And we're really delighted that we've appointed our first governance officer this year, and she's a huge advantage and bonus to our team, as well as our administration team. People who don't take care of the files and make sure everything is there when I need it, we can't do trials. This is GCP. So again, this might look like a short list of things that you have to do as part of GCP, but you actually have to make sure that all those features on the slide have actually been done correctly. So often when doctors are taught to do clinical trials, they're actually taught afresh how to sign their name, how to write the date. If you've made an error, you don't scrub it out because you've got to leave what you made the error for legible. So it's like kindergarten. You've got to actually teach all of this over and over again. And sometimes, I put a cross on my 7 and my team say to me, Eileen, that looks like a 1. And I have to do it again. So, the robustness of the data in any registration drug trial is enormously high. So that should say to the patient and the community, the results are believable. They've been verified, they've been audited again and again and again by independent people who don't have a monetary interest in the outcome of that trial. So believe it if it's been approved ultimately for use in the community. And all of it, again, it's probably obvious that you need qualified individuals, but you actually need training in knowing how to do clinical trials. It's not just something that in medical school you get taught. And there are some hospitals that don't do a lot of clinical research. So as you're going through your training, you may not actually get a lot of exposure to that. But that's one of the things that, we're very blessed here at BCRCWA because, as you know, a big focus behind everything that goes behind the foundations of what we do for metastatic and early breast cancer is evidence-based research. And so we believe that what we do, what we recommend for you as a group, is really the best thing that could be offered to anybody around the world.
Sorry, Elaine.
Yep.
Move on from that. Just a quick one. It'd be interesting from our perspective to know, inherently whether you, with the clinical trials group, have an issue with trying to find enough people to go on the trials. Is that ever like, do you go, well, I'm scraping to try and find?
Well, if you've done good feasibility prior to being involved in a project, that shouldn't be an issue. But I think just to say to you, I said to you, some of the registration trials involve 400 to 500 hospitals. Now, it may be that one hospital only puts 2 patients in for the lifetime of that trial, and that happens. So when pharmaceutical companies take on trials, they know who are their high recruiters, and so often you see the same names on the papers because it's those of us who do a lot of trials. But there are also new centres coming aboard, so you wouldn't expect a new centre with a fairly junior staff and a small number of patient population to recruit as many trials. So often it is not, set in stone, but when a company is looking at a trial, they'll basically say to the doctor, okay, we'll offer you this trial because we've looked at your infrastructure, we think you can do it. How many patients do you think you can put on? If the investigator says, I think I can do 1 in the next 5 years, it's probably unlikely that they'll be offered the trial. Now, that's a detriment to the doctor and to the patients in that hospital. But hopefully, as that doctor becomes busier and more patients come aboard. So we don't often have problems with, scratching our heads, but there are some trials, because trials are so niche now. 15 years ago, we didn't actually know about the 3 different types, triple negative, HER2 positive, ER positive. So we actually included virtually all comers. So it was very easy. I mean, there were several trials. I put more than 100 patients onto trials. Now, the trials are very, very niche. You've got to have triple negative breast cancer and you can't have had any chemotherapy. Or you have to have triple negative breast cancer and it has to be in your brain and you can't have had any chemotherapy. So all these criteria means that, if you do your feasibility properly, you should have a good estimation of whether you're going to be successful or not.
How do you determine which trials you're going to pick up to run with that have been done overseas?
I decide.
So, but do you base it on how many people will be benefited at the end of the trial, or a very specific, hard case? Or?
So two things drive what I regard as a good trial to do. One is that I know the background of the drug, I know the need in that group of women, and there's a high probability that that drug will be seen as the new standard of care. Now that's with, you can say best guess, but that's still with understanding the biology of the drug. The second reason why you might want to do a trial is it's an unmet need. To date, there's nothing enough for that group of patients. So even if you think, there could be some issues with how well it's tolerated, and I'll give you an example of this, immunotherapy, all the rage. Everybody thinks it's a good thing. We are recruiting to quite a niche immunotherapy trial, and I know one of the patients is in the audience with us, but it has a lot of side effects. A lot of side effects. So it's kind of tough. So when there's a niche and there's a need, that will often, and if I know that there are patients under my care and around that don't have other drug options, we think that's a good reason to do it as well.
While you're on immunotherapy, just one quick question. Is there typical parameters around that? Say, for example, if my cancer came back and I've already been through the chemotherapy, is there certain criteria around that? What does that look like to meet that need? Because that's, like you say, a hip and happening thing. It'd be good to know. It's not so much criteria, it's more about our current information says immunotherapy probably has the greatest benefit in triple negative breast cancers. There is some data to say that it's beneficial in HER2 positive breast cancer, but the HER2 space, as I'll show you in a minute, is a hard group of women to get better at what we're doing at, because they're the group of women that have really benefit from clinical research in the last 20 years. It's gone from, almost literally a life sentence if you were told you had metastatic HER2 positive breast cancer, to a number of my patients now that I've cured and I've discharged. I mean, that's just a huge speed of development of drugs. So to then add an immunotherapy agent to that and make it look even better, it's a really, really hard bar to reach. Unfortunately, the estrogen positive breast cancers often don't seem to respond as well to immunotherapies. But we are looking into that.
Now, I really just put this in, not because I want sympathy, but I thought, why not?
Yes, you do.
Yeah, and I thought it's good that Claire's here and, some of my staff are here because, it's not that we want your sympathy, but we really want to know what we do behind the scenes to do clinical research. So what I've listed for you in the little number brackets is how many items are responsible by me or the chief investigator under those different guidelines. And if you think about it, there are 38 criteria that have to be met to ensure that I have provided informed consent to patients. So that takes, just looking at the things that has to be done, it takes a lot of time. And look, it's what we know we have to do, so we sort of accept it and try not to complain too much. But, there are times if you're thinking a bit worn down, you're thinking, how many times am I going to be asked this question again? Always remember, I have to do more. So the role of the principal investigator, and this, the co-investigators have an important role because when they see patients, how they assess the patient, what remarks they make, what treatment they make are also incredibly important. So I don't want in any way say that that's not important, but at the end of the day, the buck stops with me. So if the pharmacist gave out one pill too little, if the blood test was done 5 minutes later, if the ECG was only 2 copies and not 3, not done intentionally by anybody, it's me that cops the flag. Thankfully, none of those are major issues, but certainly safety issues have to be left with the medical person that's involved in the trial. So if a patient has a side effect and it's not been dealt with or identified, all of that lies in the hands of the doctor, which it does, whether a patient is involved in a clinical trial or not. But the other part that the principal investigator has to play is also not just coordinating your team, not just informing your patient, but in large collaborative trials, particularly with a pharmaceutical company, it's the principal investigator that is the person that has to negotiate, finer points and finer details. Something that I don't enjoy doing. That's probably the part of clinical research that I dislike the most. But that's necessary. In doing a very complex trial between 500 hospitals with a whole lot of different things, it requires a lot of communication back and forth, time differences, Google meetings in the middle of the night to discuss things, review information. So it is a big time commitment. That was the best picture I could find of me when I have to sign off, because what it means is during the trial and before a trial can be closed, analysed, and then put forward for presentation, publication, and health authority approval, the PI has to actually, literally, physically sign every bit of paper that has been used to collect information on patients. So I generally sign, now that Claire's here, she helps me because she signs a lot of things on my behalf as well. But, probably between the two of us, we probably sign something like, 200 bits of paper a week. And apart from that, now in the electronic era, I actually have to go on and sign electronically, and that's not an easy task. They change my username every 3 months. They change my password every 3 months. Every company uses a different program with a different way of signing. So all I can tell you is that data sign-off gives me that appearance every time I have to do it. And I think probably the last thing I want to say in terms of how important clinical research is for the benefit of mankind as opposed to complementary therapies, anecdotal therapies, and so forth, is that it's robust. Not only has it robustly evaluated whether it's likely to work in the laboratory, it's robustly evaluated whether it works in human beings. More importantly, it's identified what all the potential safety issues are. So it's actually not quite true when people say, vitamin C is in oranges, so I get an infusion of vitamin C. It's the kind of same thing, it's a natural product. Not true. When you give high-dose vitamin C intravenously, there are major potential for side effects with your veins. If you're going to stick anything into any orifice into a human being, you really need to know that it's going to work and it's going to help the patient and what the potential harm is. And unfortunately, a lot of the complementary alternative therapies don't do that. It's all anecdotal. I've treated 600 patients, they all felt better.
Can I just ask a question about that? isn't part of the problem that a lot of those complementary therapies, there's no money for the pharmaceutical companies in doing a trial, so how can you ever get that kind of data on some of the things that might be effective but really need to be proven?
Well, yeah, that's a point. But if you think about it, it's a two-edged sword, because a pharmaceutical company is going to benefit if their drug is beneficial. Every company that is evaluating drug trials for cancer patients, let alone breast cancer patients, take a big gamble. They will lose millions, if not billions, if they don't do due process and get good information. So it's not always a win-win situation for pharmaceutical companies. My response when I get asked that question, because I get asked that question a lot, is even if you're proposing and promoting a non-pharmaceutical product, be it vitamin C, turmeric, garlic, whatever, there is still avenues to getting research money. All of us work really, really hard. I haven't even mentioned that because I don't think that's relevant to you guys, how I try and find money to do all the research. But that's a big, big part of the commitment. So, if you have good biological understanding that your natural product is potentially effective based on anecdotal experience, and you've got the know-how of understanding why that drug should help a person, you spend the time in developing the protocol. You spend the time attracting money, and you can do a well-conducted evidence-based trial. The problem is, if you look, I can't remember what the figure is, but a few years ago I looked at how much was spent on alternative therapies for cancer, and it was in like 20 billion. So somebody is benefiting from selling those products. So I think it's a completely, erroneous argument to say we don't have a pharmaceutical company backing us, so we can't do the research. I completely refute that. You've got to have the commitment, and you've got to have belief, and you've got to believe that it's something that's worthwhile to prove. And I think to say, well, it's natural, I don't have pharmaceutical background, so I'm just going to promote it because I have anecdotal evidence, I think it's completely erroneous. People shouldn't be accepting that that's, an appropriate reasoning to do it.
Yeah, but isn't there more money in a synthetic drug than there is in turmeric? I mean, isn't this why it would be more difficult to get the science community level research done on some of the more natural therapies, whether they're dealing with cancer direct or, side effects or that kind of thing? There's more money in doxorubicin than there is in turmeric root. So wouldn't it be more difficult to get that kind of research done?
I say no, because the monetary benefits that you've talked about is for the owner or the patent holder of the drug. And I hope in the preceding slides I've shown you, a pharmaceutical company cannot do the research needed to get their product done unless they've got doctors, nurses, clinical. We don't make money. We get reimbursed for the teamwork that we do, but we don't make benefits from it. So when you say, why can't scientists, put their efforts into doing turmeric? Well, I have not enough time to get enough sleep doing clinical research trials just in breast cancer, let alone trying to develop protocols, grant funding for turmeric. And therefore, if you're a person that's a big believer in turmeric, then you go and get the money. And then what you do is you collaborate with people like me. Go and design the trial. I'm always open for collaboration when people have got good, sound, rational. I've been approached probably in my sort of research career maybe 2 or 3 times with outside parties. They weren't pharmaceutical companies, but they were a group with some kind of internal finances. And it really didn't get more beyond an initial, are you interested? Because every question I asked was not dealt with. They just wanted, me to help to get their agent marketed. So
I get that, but you said that the profit goes to the pharmaceutical company. The equivalent would be, let's stick with the turmeric theme, that would be the turmeric grower would be getting, this is where the profit comes in, okay? The Pfizer or whoever, gets the profit from the new drug that comes out, but who gets the real profit for something like ginger or turmeric or whatever?
The person who thinks that's a good thing. Benefit is not just money. Benefit is knowing that you've actually helped somebody live longer, cured, live a better life. That might be a little bit altruistic, but I think if you believe in an alternative natural treatment if you're a real believer in that, you should do the research to get that product on the market or used at least without expecting any monetary return. So the ethos is different. If you're not a pharmaceutical company and you're not going to get any monetary benefit from getting turmeric out there, and you say, well, therefore I'm not going to do research, I think that's a wrong argument. The reason you want to get turmeric out there is you believe it's going to help people, and when it helps people, you're going to feel good about what you've contributed to society. So that's how I feel it.
Sorry, Alex.
Yeah.
This is kind of flashing a dead horse
Yeah.
here, I don't know. But didn't you just say that the trials, like some of the pharmaceutical companies spent like $100 billion on trials or something? I mean, they take a gamble. They've got a product that they created and they can patent, and if it's successful, they will sell for a lot of money. So they make a financial gamble. But for something like this, for a big proper trial, where does that money come from?
So for what kind of trial?
Something like turmeric.
Okay. If you've got a good scientific rationale, you spend the time to saying, I've developed this protocol which is feasible, and I've actually got doctors or healthcare practices that will have patients to put in the trial. You go for independent grants. Every country has a number of independent. The Cancer Council has yearly grants. NHMRC has yearly grants. BCF, Breast Cancer Foundation, has yearly grants. Some of the universities have grants. Philanthropy offer grants. So you've got to sort of be in the know-how. You've got to actually get around and say, well, okay, I'm not going to get money from a pharmaceutical company, but there are a number of independent, philanthropic, academic groups that if your idea is a good one, you'll get a grant. And I'll come to that. I write a lot of investigator-initiated research. I get no money from it because I generally don't investigate a product which I'm going to patent. Some doctors do, but I don't. I have to get independent grants for that.
Is that something that we as a group could push forward if there's something that's interesting to...
You could. I mean, essentially, for instance, we get a lot of generosity from this group and everybody that supports BCRCWA already. Now, and this hasn't been done, but I've always said this to the individual person that says, I'm going to give you, $10,000. And I always say to them, what area of research or education would you like your donation to go to? And I generally get whatever you think you want to use it for. So if somebody, that is part of our sort of group says, look, I'm really interested in doing this, I'm going to help raise the money for it, that's the first step. The second step is who's going to write the protocol? Who's going to collect the data? Who's going to meet all the guidelines for GCP? Because you have to, even though it's a commercially available thing, if it's going to be used in a therapeutic testing, you have to meet all these guidelines. Who's going to do it? And so you have to find somebody that's going to be the champion. So it's not just about money. The money, I think, is actually the easiest part. So those people out there who think, intravenous venous flytrap is worthwhile, they believe in that product, they should then spend the time and effort to go and get the money to evaluate their product. I'm going to move on because I haven't even gone on to the next bit.
Aline, can I just say one thing though?
Yep.
You need scientific validation before it gets to that point.
Yes.
You need due process before Eileen even sees it. So you can't just get a bit of turmeric. Someone in the science lab has to validate that. And then it goes to someone like Eileen for phase 1. So it's not like giving you
I mean, I guess the thing is with something like turmeric, where you know that you use it as part of your cooking. I don't know what doses are pushed out to the community, and if there's a big dose difference between what you cook with and what you want to use therapeutically, then it has to be evaluated, very much so. But if you want to use things like vitamins and so forth within the therapeutic safety dosage, you may not need to have to go through as much of what's been said, but you still need to have a good scientific reason why you're going to do that, because you're going to invest a lot of people's time, a lot of patients' time, and potentially a grant funding to evaluate that product. So somebody who, and it's usually the person who's committed to that product, has to know the biological basis of why this should be done. Okay.